after my previous video on the 9th Doctor version of the 50th anniversary, which by the way, thank you for all the support on, I really enjoyed making that video, it got me to thinking about the other what-if concepts in Doctor Who history, the stuff that very well could have been if things went slightly differently. And there's one that's arguably the most prolific in Doctor Who fandom that I've never spoken about but always wanted to, and that's the idea that David Tennant could have stayed for Doctor Who Series 5. And I think what makes this a fascinating possibility for Doctor Who fans to discuss is that this very nearly was a thing. David Tennant reportedly considered it, and in Moffat's own words, the BBC weren't sure whether they could even continue the show without David Tennant, owing to how popular he was. At Hay, Moffat added that the BBC also thought a Tennant-free Doctor Who wouldn't succeed at all. That was quite terrifying when I found out about it later. David owned that role in a spectacular way, gave it an all-new cheeky, sexy performance, and became a national treasure. And he didn't do it instantly, he did it over time. So the idea that Doctor Who could go on at all in the absence of David was a huge question. I think there were plans maybe to consider ending it. It took Russell T Davies saying, "You are not allowed to end it." So that just gives you an idea of just how close we came to Doctor Who ending without Tennant. This was a very worrisome prospect for Stephen Moffat and co. So the idea of a David Tennant Series 5, I would argue, is actually one of the more likely what-if scenarios in Doctor Who's history. But what would this series actually have entailed? Well, we have a few quotes from Stephen Moffat that I want to go over and discuss, as well as kind of imbue it with my own ideas to form David Tennant's version of Doctor Who Series 5. The main place I'll be quoting here is The Fan Show, that released an interview with Stephen Moffat towards the end of his tenure, where he discussed this exact topic. During the interview, Stephen Moffat said the following: "Well, David was just going through the now to me very familiar angst about leaving. Piers Wenger, former executive producer, and I went to talk about David, and I ran him through what that series would be if it was him. It would have definitely been his last one, there was no question about that." So yeah, this would have definitely been the last David Tennant Doctor Who series, and I imagine that a new actor, possibly Matt Smith, possibly someone else, would have taken over after this point. My version of that series would be that the David Tennant Doctor would crash into the back garden, about to regenerate, and a little Amelia would help him back to the TARDIS, and he'd fly off. And that she'd then meet him again when she grew up, but he'd have no memory of that, because we come to realise that was the Doctor from the future. We'd make our way through the series to the point where the Doctor gets back to that. I sort of used that idea again later, which is true, he did. That was very much kind of the crux of the Series 6 arc, where the Doctor gets killed off right at the beginning of the series, and the rest of the series kind of revolves around getting back to that point. So I could have definitely seen this working. So that would have been the show, and he thought very hard about it, and he left me a message on my answer phone saying he thought very hard about it, and as I thought he would, he decided to move on. We also have another quote from Moffat that just sort of reiterates the same thing, but does make this interesting comment. "Amelia finds him, feeds him fish custard. No, that was for Matt. It would have been something more David-y, and generally helps him, but we the audience can see he's truly in a bad way, dying maybe. Eventually he heads back to the TARDIS and flies off." So the thing that interests me there is the concept of Amy feeding the 10th Doctor something more 10th Doctor-y. Ideas that came to my head were Satsumas, pears, which I know he hates, but he's regenerating, so you could say his mind's gone all weird, or possibly a cake with those ball bearings on them from Fear. What do you guys think Amy would have fed the 10th Doctor in this scenario? Let me know. The final quote we have for this version is another quote from The Fan Show, where he says this:
"It was, frankly, if David and Catherine had wanted to continue, I wouldn't have done that. It would have been the same TARDIS, it would have, because there was no way that version of the show was worn out."
So we know that, like, the TARDIS would have generally been the same if this series had happened, which leads me to believe as well that the kind of brand overhaul that Doctor Who got in 2010 would have likely been held off another year as well, so you probably would have had the same logo, the same general title sequence, as had been the case in the David Tennant series prior. He does also mention Catherine Tate choosing to leave or not, so I don't know whether the idea of continuing Donna was ever on the table, but given the way that Russell seemed to end off her story, I highly doubt Moffat would have. It seems like it would have created a lot more questions and difficulties in terms of the narrative of Series 5 if you throw Donna's memory into the mix as well, so I'm going to assume that Donna wouldn't actually be in Series 5. But this does raise the question, how would the general format of Series 5 change with all this in mind? So obviously, like Moffat said, it would open with the Doctor landing in Amy's back garden as the 10th Doctor, about to die. He gets nursed back to health by a young Amy Pond. He travels away, comes back when she's an adult, very similarly to what we see in Series 5, the regular version. And I think, honestly, most of the episodes could go on relatively untouched. There are a couple of fundamental differences, though, that I think this would make. For one thing, I don't think Moffat would go down the Amy having a crush on the Doctor angle that he ultimately went down in Series 5 before she eventually settles down with Rory. At this point in his life, David Tennant's Doctor, yes, is one of the romantic ones, but he's probably slightly over all of that at this stage in his life. Not to mention the age gap between David Tennant and Karen Gillan, whilst, not huge, is noticeable enough to where I think the romantic dynamic might have been seen as maybe not the best idea. Obviously, you could argue she was a child when the Doctor met her, but still, I think they probably wouldn't have gone the romantic angle, at least in those early Series 5 days. Moffat has even said he regretted doing it with the 11th Doctor, period, so the chances of it being done with the 10th Doctor, to me, in this series, are pretty minimal. Another big question with this series, though, is the series arc, how that would work, the Pandorica. Now, obviously, we know that in our version of Series 5, cracks in time appear wherever the TARDIS lands, and we reveal that it's actually because the TARDIS explodes at the end of the series, and the cracks are a result of that. This leads to the pantheon of kind of enemies of the Doctor, sealing the Doctor away in the Pandorica to protect the universe for its ultimate collapse. I think you could do something similar to this, but just have it be that the 10th Doctor surviving is what caused the cracks in time. This is something that wasn't meant to happen, so like with the Reapers in, say, Father's Day, the cracks represent the universe trying to compensate for this, and only by exploding the TARDIS, therefore killing himself in the process, can the universe reset and everything becomes normal again. And then we end off the series back where we start with him regenerating. So essentially, you could do a thing where the events of this series don't technically happen, or at least, they do, but people don't remember them, sort of like what they did in Series 3. There's definitely ways you could do that. There are other things that would certainly be interesting. First of all, I think seeing David Tennant's reaction to the return of the Daleks and the rise of the Dalek paradigm would have been really cool, especially considering that was the face that got rid of the Daleks for what he thought was for good. So for him to see the Daleks come back so quickly and more powerful than ever, I think would have really been interesting, and I think David would have really sold those scenes. I think, for the record, I think Matt does as well. I'm just saying it'd be interesting to see David's version of that performance. Same goes for his reaction to seeing River Song again, actually. If anything, it kind of makes sense, because when River meets the 10th Doctor's face, she assumes they've met before, which implies that Tennant's face isn't pre-meeting River Song. So by having the 10th Doctor be at the crash of the Byzantium, it would explain why she's like, oh, you don't know me yet? That's weird. Obviously, I know Big Finish came along later on and basically said that every Doctor has met River, but still. I also don't think we would have had kind of the rivalry between the Doctor and Rory with the 10th Doctor either, mainly because we'd already sort of done that with Rose and Nikki Smith, and I think it would have just felt too much like retreading that ground. I would have been curious to see what the 10th Doctor's Dream Lord looked like, though. On the whole, though, while there's definitely some interesting concepts that could have been explored with the David Tennant Series 5, I ultimately do think it is for the best that we got what we got. As you guys all know, Matt Smith is my favourite Doctor, and Series 5 is probably my favourite series of the revival at least, so I probably wouldn't have it any other way personally, but it is interesting to sort of gaze into an alternate reality where David Tennant stayed on, and I still think the series would have overall been good, but I think with hindsight, it was the right thing for the show, for a new person to come in and kind of prove that Doctor Who could exist beyond him, especially because David, as much as I love him, has come back for both subsequent anniversaries, so I don't really think we needed a fourth series with him as well. Nothing against David, it's just sort of like, let someone else have a go, you know what I mean? Although having said that, I wouldn't be against the idea of Big Finish adapting this at some point in the future if Karen Gillan ever got on board. But what do you think? Would you have been interested to see Doctor Who Series 5 starring David Tennant? Whatever your thoughts are, drop them down in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.